A forest grew on a dead planet where nothing should have survived, born from a device with a battery that died 6,000 years ago. And every alien who studied it agreed on one impossible detail. Only humanity could have planted something that stubborn. Where are you watching from? And if you want more impossible truths like this, subscribe, and let's begin the story. Arvin Solk had excavated 47 empty holes in his career. This would be 48. The archaeologist adjusted his environmental suit against New Helion's brutal heat, watching his team set up scanning equipment around the latest promising coordinate. Promising. The word had lost meaning 6 months ago. Somewhere between the false alarm at Site Gamma and the embarrassing incident at what turned out to be a geological formation, not a temple. His species, the Karuth, were naturally skeptical. Evolution on a tidally locked world had taught them to trust only what they could see, touch, and verify 3 times over. So when the scanners pinged with hollow readings beneath the sand, Arvin felt nothing but tired anticipation of disappointment. "Another cavity?" announced Jex, his second in command, mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement or resignation. Hard to tell with Jex. Lyra, the young Vela researcher, moved closer to the scanning display. Her blue skin seemed to shimmer in the harsh sunlight, and her large eyes held something Arvin had learned to recognize over the past year. Hope. Misguided, probably, but persistent. "The formation is regular," she said quietly. "Too regular." "Mineral deposits can be regular," Arvin replied, but he was already signaling the excavation drones. "Might as well dig. That's what the Archaeo-Intergalactic Coalition paid them for. Dig, catalog, file reports that no one read, and occasionally discover something underwhelming enough to warrant a footnote in an academic journal." The drones worked efficiently, their plasma cutters slicing through compacted sand that had sat undisturbed for millennia. New Helion was the Coalition's designated study site for extinct civilizations, chosen specifically because its extreme environment preserved things that other worlds eroded away. The irony wasn't lost on Arvin. They studied death on a planet that killed everything slowly. "We have an entrance," Jex announced. Arvin approached the excavation pit. Where sand had been, now there was darkness, and stairs, actual stairs, descending into preserved gloom. The team exchanged glances. Stairs meant intentional architecture. Architecture meant civilization, and in this sector, 6,000 years dead, that could only mean one thing. "Humans?" Lyra whispered, and Arvin heard the reverence in her voice. The extinct species had become mythology among younger researchers. Some said humans had ascended to pure energy. Others claimed they'd been destroyed by their own machines. Academic consensus leaned toward self-annihilation through warfare, but no one really knew. No functional human artifacts had ever been recovered. Just ruins, debris, and endless speculation. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Arvin said, but his pulse had quickened despite himself. They descended carefully, lights cutting through air that hadn't moved in eons. The temperature dropped immediately. Arvin's instrument showed an almost hermetic seal had preserved this space. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a chamber. It was small. Disappointingly so. Arvin had half expected grand halls, towering monuments to a lost civilization. Instead, they got a room barely large enough for storage. Metal shelves had collapsed into rust. What might have been containers had degraded into powder. In the corner, something that looked like furniture had become a skeleton of itself. Lyra moved toward the back wall, then stopped abruptly. "There's something here," she said, and her voice carried an odd tension. Arvin joined her, and his breath caught. On a small platform, surrounded by the dust of time, sat a perfect rectangle. Black, smooth, no larger than his hand. And unlike everything else in this tomb, it was intact. More than intact. When Arvin's light beam crossed it, something on its surface flickered. "Is that—" Jex started. "A display screen," Arvin finished. Cracked, but present. His hand trembled as he reached out. Protocol dictated he should scan first, analyze, document every step. but something pulled him forward. He touched the smooth surface. The screen lit up. 2 words appeared in ancient Earth Standard, a language Arvin had spent years learning to read from fragments and ruins. 2 words that should have been impossible after 6,000 years. Battery low. Then came a sound that made everyone freeze. A soft, rhythmic beep. Quiet, almost apologetic, but unmistakably active. "Energy signature confirmed," Jex said, his voice tight with something that might have been excitement or fear. "The device is powered. After 6 millennia, the device is still powered." Arvin stared at the words on the screen. Battery low, as if someone had just put it down yesterday and forgotten to charge it. As if time was a minor inconvenience rather than an absolute erosion of everything. Lyra touched his shoulder gently. "What does it mean?" "It means," Arvin said slowly, feeling something shift in his understanding of the universe, "that we need to be very, very careful, because if this still works after 6,000 years... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all understood. If a human device could survive this long, still functional, still carrying power, then maybe everything they thought they knew about humanity was wrong. The beep echoed in the silence of the chamber. Patient. Waiting. Arvin carefully lifted the device. It was lighter than he expected, warm to the touch despite millennia of darkness. The screen flickered again, and new text appeared briefly before fading. Playback available. "What did it say?" Lyra asked. "It wants to show us something," Arvin replied. In the corner of the screen, the battery indicator pulsed red. The device was dying, but not yet dead, and after 6,000 years of silence, it had something to say. The Coalition's orbital research station hummed with its usual efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaos in Lab 7. Director Marn Thurek stood before the examination table, his Zorkan features locked in what Arvin had learned to recognize as bureaucratic disapproval. "Another human myth," Thurek said, his voice carrying the weight of administrative certainty. "Catalog it, seal it, file the report. We have more productive excavations to fund." "With respect, Director," Arvin began, knowing he had none to give. "This device is still powered. After 6,000 years, impossible." "And yet," Arvin gestured to the examination table where the small black rectangle sat, its screen still displaying those 2 haunting words. Battery low. The beep had continued for 3 days now, steady as a heartbeat, driving the lab technicians slowly insane. Thurek's eye stalks contracted, a sign of irritation. The Coalition's historical narrative is clear. Humans were barbaric, self-destructive, and ultimately eliminated themselves through technological hubris. This device is likely a sensor malfunction or geological anomaly mimicking power output. "We've run every test," Lyra interjected from her workstation, her blue fingers dancing across holographic displays. "The energy signature is consistent with ancient Earth battery technology. Degraded, yes, but functional. Director, nothing we've built lasts a tenth this long. Which is precisely why it's impossible." The circular logic made Arvin's head ache. He'd spent 3 nights staring at the device, unable to sleep, feeling an irrational connection to it. As if it was staring back, as if it was waiting for something. On the 4th night, exhausted and frustrated by the director's order to seal the device without further study, Arvin made a decision that would alter the course of galactic history. He stayed late in the lab, alone. The device sat on its examination platform, beeping patiently in the darkness. The cracked screen glowed faint in the dim emergency lighting. "What are you?" Arvin whispered to it. "What are you trying to tell us?" His finger hovered over the screen. Protocol demanded he wait for the full analysis team. Policy required director approval for any activation sequence. Caution suggested he not touch anything that had survived 6,000 years without understanding why. He touched it anyway. The screen blazed to life with startling brightness. Icons appeared, rendered in ancient Earth symbols that took Arvin a moment to parse. A battery indicator, critical red. A camera symbol. And in the center, a simple triangle pointing right. Play. His hand trembled. Behind him, he heard the lab door open. "Don't you dare!" came Lyra's voice, but there was no anger in it, just breathless anticipation. She'd followed him. Of course she had. "We're going to be fired," Arvin said. "Probably. And it might show us nothing useful. Probably. The director will seal this forever. Definitely." Lyra moved beside him, her large eyes reflecting the screen's glow. "So we'd better make it count." Arvin pressed play. For 3 seconds nothing happened. Then the screen flickered and static filled it. Audio crackled, an ancient compression algorithm struggling to decode information that had waited millennia to be heard. Then a face appeared. Human. Female. Unmistakably exhausted, with moisture tracking down her face in what Arvin's xenobiology training identified as tears. Behind her something was burning. Smoke filled what looked like a collapsed structure. Alarms wailed in the background. "If anyone is seeing this," the woman said, her voice rough with emotion and smoke damage, "it means we failed." Arvin felt Lyra grip his arm. The woman continued, "But if this device still exists, if it found its way to you, then maybe something of us survived. I'm Dr. Ellen Reeves, NASA Engineering Division. The date is June 14th, 2847, and this is my message to whoever comes after." The video distorted, corrupted data creating visual artifacts. When it stabilized, Ellen's face had changed, more composed, more purposeful. "I don't know who you are, what you are. I don't know if you'll understand our language, our context, our desperate last attempts to save what we could. But I'm betting on something my species always excelled at: hope." She smiled, and it was the saddest thing Arvin had ever seen. "Power it on when the sun rises. Let the light touch it. Let it show you what we were, not just what we did. Please. Remember us as more than our endings." The video stuttered, froze, and cut to black. One final message appeared on screen. "Video playback incomplete. Battery 7%. Continue transmission at sunrise for optimal data recovery." The beep resumed, but now Arvin heard it differently. Not an alert, a plea. Lyra was crying. Her species didn't naturally produce tears, but her eyes glistened with the effort. "She left instructions for beings who didn't exist yet," she whispered. "She was dying, and she left instructions for us." Arvin looked at the frozen frame of Ellen's face, suspended in time and grief and impossible hope. "What do we do?" Lyra asked. Arvin straightened, feeling something his species didn't have a word for. Determination mixed with sorrow. Purpose born from loss. "We wait for sunrise," he said. "And we give her what she asked for. Director Thurek will have us imprisoned." "They built things that outlasted them by 6,000 years, Arvin replied, touching the screen gently. "We can barely leave footprints. I think we owe them at least a sunrise." The device beeped agreement, and somewhere in its dying circuits, Dr. Ellen Reeves waited to speak again. The data extraction took 2 days, 2 days during which Director Thurek sent increasingly threatening messages, 2 days during which Arvin and Lyra barely slept, and 2 days during which the device's battery indicator dropped from 7% to 5%. They were running out of time. Another fragment recovered, Lyra announced, her voice thick with exhaustion and something else, something that sounded like mourning. The holographic display flickered to life. This wasn't a message like Ellen's desperate transmission. This was something else entirely, something the device had been programmed to preserve beyond all else. A man appeared in the video, standing in what looked like a residential space. He was cooking, moving between surfaces with practiced ease, and singing. Actually singing, producing melodic sounds that served no apparent functional purpose. "What is he doing?" asked Jex, who had joined them despite his better judgment. Professional curiosity, he'd claimed. Arvin suspected it was more than that. "Creating food," Lyra said, "but also, I think he's happy." The concept seemed foreign in its simplicity. The Karuth ate nutrient paste. The Vela consumed synthesized compounds. The Zorkon photosynthesized. But this human was taking raw ingredients, applying heat and chemical reactions, and seemed to be enjoying the inefficient process immensely. The video cut to another fragment. A human female kneeling on grass, arms wrapped around a four-legged creature covered in fur. The creature's tail moved in rhythmic sweeps, and both human and animal appeared to be experiencing positive emotional states. "She's bonding with it," Lyra whispered. "It's not even her species, and she loves it." Arvin felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. His species didn't form attachments like this. Karuth mated for genetic compatibility, raised offspring in communal centers, and separated when their evolutionary purpose was fulfilled. Efficient, logical, utterly without the warm chaos displayed in these fragments. More videos played. A human child, barely mobile, attempting to walk, while two adults watched with expressions of pride and anxiety. The child fell, and instead of cataloging the failure and moving to the next trial, the adults picked the child up and encouraged another attempt. "They celebrate incompetence," Jex observed, confused. "No," Lyra said, and there were tears in her eyes again. Real ones this time, her body adapting to an emotional expression it had never needed before. They celebrate trying. The effort itself holds value, not just the outcome. Arvin watched video after video. Humans eating together, no purpose except proximity. Humans creating art that served no survival function. Humans touching each other constantly, casually, as if connection was as necessary as oxygen. "This is what Director Thurek doesn't want us to see," Arvin said quietly. They weren't just builders and warriors. They were alive in ways we never allowed ourselves to be. A message pinged his console. Director Thurek, demanding their presence immediately, promising consequences. Lyra looked up from her analysis station, and Arvin saw something had changed in her. "I've been having dreams," she said, "about Earth, about places I've never been, speaking words in languages I was never taught. That's impossible. Everything about this is impossible." She gestured to the device, still beeping its patient countdown. I think my species had contact with them before the end. We never recorded it, never acknowledged it, but somewhere in my genetic memory, there's an echo of them." She pulled up another fragment. This one was different. It showed Earth, but not the thriving world from history texts. This Earth was dying, oceans receding, cities half buried in sand, atmosphere visibly degraded. But in the foreground, humans were planting trees. Dozens of them, working in environmental suits, placing saplings in soil that couldn't possibly sustain them. It was futile, pointless. The world was ending, and they were gardening. "Why?" Jex asked, and for the first time his skepticism had cracked. "Why waste energy on something that cannot survive?" "Because," Arvin said, understanding flooding through him with the force of revelation, they weren't trying to save themselves. They were trying to leave something beautiful for whoever came next. Lyra's console emitted an urgent alert. Critical power warning. Battery at 4%. The extraction process was draining it faster than anticipated. "We have maybe 12 hours, she said. "Then it dies. Forever." Director Thurek's final message appeared, overriding their displays. All personnel to report immediately. Security teams dispatched. Threat of forcible equipment seizure. The historical narrative cannot be destabilized, Thurek's message read. Humanity was barbaric, self-destructive, and ultimately destroyed by their own nature. Maintain consensus. Seal the device. This is not a request. Arvin looked at the screen showing a human child laughing at something off camera. Pure joy captured in corrupted pixels. They weren't gods or monsters, he said, more to himself than anyone else. They were just alive, messily, inefficiently, beautifully alive. "So what do we do?" Lyra asked. Arvin checked the chronometer. Dawn was in 6 hours. The device's battery indicator pulsed red, each beep feeling more urgent now. "We give Ellen what she asked for," he said. "We wait for sunrise, and we let them speak for themselves. We'll be arrested. Probably. The device might not survive long enough. Possibly. It might all be for nothing." Arven smiled and realized he'd learned the expression from watching those fragments. From seeing humans smile through tragedy, through loss, through the certain ending of everything they knew. "Then we fail like humans would," he said. "Trying anyway." The device beeped its agreement, and Ellen Reeves waited in its dying memory, ready to teach the universe one final lesson about what it meant to hope against hope itself. Arvin had never broken a rule in his life. His species didn't have rebellions. Karuth psychology was built on consensus and adherence to established structures. The very concept of defying authority made his neural pathways spasm with discomfort, which is why he was absolutely terrible at lying. The device experienced a critical malfunction, he told the security checkpoint guard, his voice somehow managing to be both too loud and too quiet. "We need to return it to the excavation site for proper environmental containment." The guard, a Zorkon named Vex, studied him with all 3 eyes. Director Thurek's orders specify immediate surrender to archives. "Yes, but there's a special protocol for devices exhibiting temporal anomalies." Arvin was sweating, which his species only did during mating season or extreme distress. "It's very technical, very boring, lots of paperwork." Vex's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." "No," Arvin said, far too quickly. "Definitely lying." Lyra stepped forward, and Arvin marveled at how naturally deception seemed to come to her. "Look, we're all going to be fired anyway. The director wants this thing sealed and forgotten because it contradicts 50 years of accepted historical narrative. You can stop us and be part of maintaining a comfortable lie, or you can let us pass, and maybe, just maybe, learn something true about the universe." She paused, then added, "Also, Arvin is a terrible liar. If this was official, do you really think they'd send him?" Vex considered this for a long moment. Then, with a gesture that might have been the Zorkon equivalent of a shrug, he stepped aside. "I was on break. I saw nothing." "Thank you," Lyra breathed. "Don't thank me. If this goes wrong, I'll testify I was coerced." "Fair enough." They ran, carrying the device between them like it was made of glass. Which, in a way, it was. Glass and ancient metals and impossible engineering and 6,000 years of stubborn refusal to stop existing. 2 more checkpoints. 2 more terrible lies. At the third, Jex appeared with 2 lab technicians Arvin barely knew. "You're not doing this alone," Jex said. "I've spent 40 years cataloging dead civilizations. I'd like to hear one speak just once." The technicians nodded. One, a young Karuth named Ven, added, "My great teacher used to say, 'True science asks questions, even when answers are inconvenient.' I think she'd want me here." They made it to the shuttle bay. 4 hours until sunrise on New Helion's surface. Battery at 3%. During the descent, Arvin accessed the device's deeper file structure, finding a corrupted video tagged simply "Context." He played it. Ellen appeared, but this was earlier. She looked healthier, determined rather than resigned. She was in what Arvin recognized as an engineering bay, surrounded by equipment. "Recording log, day 47 of Project Last Light," she said, speaking rapidly. "The atmospheric collapse is accelerating. We have maybe 6 months before Earth becomes uninhabitable. The colony ships failed. The terraforming initiative failed. The orbital sanctuaries are failing. We're out of time and out of miracles." She held up the device, and Arvin realized he was seeing the very thing they now carried. New, gleaming, full of potential. "So we're trying something different. Not survival. Memory. I've modified 47 of these personal devices to serve as time capsules. Redundant power systems. data preservation algorithms, and a simple protocol. Show our lives, not just our achievements. Show our failures alongside our dreams. Show that we were people, not just a cautionary tale in someone else's history books. Ellen's expression softened. I don't know if anyone will find these. I don't know if anyone will care, but I'm choosing to believe that somewhere, sometime, someone will dig one up and think they were worth remembering. She smiled, and it reached her eyes. That's hope. Irrational, impractical, statistically unlikely hope. It's the most human thing we do. The recording shifted to another segment. Ellen was older now, more tired. The base behind her was clearly failing. Final log. The others have gone to be with their families for the end. I stayed to complete the programming. Each device is set to activate at sunrise. Something about that felt right. Endings and beginnings. Death and dawn. She paused, touching the device almost lovingly. To whoever finds this, we weren't perfect. We fought wars over resources we could have shared. We poisoned our own air chasing profit. We knew what we were doing wrong, and did it anyway, because changing felt harder than continuing. Another pause, longer this time. But we also sang while we cooked dinner. We loved creatures that weren't even our species. We planted trees we'd never see grow tall. We tried to be kind even when kindness cost everything. Ellen looked directly at the camera, and Arven felt she was seeing him across 6,000 years. If there's anything of us in you, I hope it's that. The stubborn, stupid insistence on caring even when the universe gives you every reason not to. The recording ended. Lyra was crying again. So was Ven. Even Jex looked shaken. Why is she smiling? Lyra asked through tears. Her world is dying. Her species is ending. Why does she smile? Arven thought about the videos they'd seen. The man singing while cooking, the woman hugging her pet, the parents celebrating a child's awkward steps. Because for humans, he said slowly, joy didn't require permission from circumstances. They chose it, even at the end. Especially at the end. The shuttle touched down on New Helion's surface. The sky was beginning to lighten, maybe 90 minutes until sunrise. Battery at 2%. Jex's console lit up with incoming transmissions. Director Thurek is deploying security forces. We have perhaps an hour before they arrive. Then we'd better make it count, Arven said, and realized he'd learned that phrase from Ellen's logs. Make it count. Value the moment because moments were all anyone ever had. They carried the device to the coordinates Ellen had programmed. Home, the GPS had said. They'd assumed it meant Earth. But now Arven understood. Home was wherever this device landed, whoever found it, whatever purpose it served. She left instructions for people who didn't exist. Ven said, carefully positioning the device on a flat stone where the sunrise would hit it directly. That's either insane or the bravest thing I've ever heard. Both, Arven replied. Humans were both. That's what made them remarkable. The sky brightened further. Battery at 1%. The device beeped. Faster now. Urgent. Here we go, Lyra whispered. 6,000 years, and we're about to hear what she wanted to say. The first ray of sunlight touched the device's surface, and somewhere in its dying circuits, Dr. Ellen Reeves prepared to deliver her final lesson to a universe that had forgotten how to hope without reason. The sunlight hit the device's surface like a kiss, and for a moment, nothing happened. Just 6 aliens standing in a desert, holding their breath, hoping for a miracle from a species they'd never met. Then the screen blazed with light. Solar charging detected, Lyra read from her scanner. It's drawing power from the sun. She built it to recharge at dawn. Brilliant, Jex breathed. Absolutely brilliant. The device began cycling through startup sequences, ancient code waking from hibernation. The screen showed progress bars, system checks, file integrity confirmations. Everything was degraded, barely functional, held together by engineering that refused to surrender to entropy. Battery, 2%, sufficient for final transmission. There, Ven pointed to the horizon. Dust clouds, security shuttles. Arvin checked his chronometer. 20 minutes, maybe less. Director Thurek wasn't coming to observe. He was coming to stop them, to silence the device forever and maintain the comfortable narrative that humanity was a cautionary tale. Nothing more. "We need more time," Lyra said, her voice tight with desperation. "We don't have it." Arvin positioned himself between the device and the approaching shuttles. His legs felt weak. Karuth weren't built for heroic stands. They were built for careful analysis and measured decisions and survival through caution. But Ellen hadn't been cautious. She'd spent her world's last days building hope for strangers. The least he could do was stand his ground. "When they arrive," Arvin said quietly, "I'll handle them. Keep recording. No matter what." The device chimed, video playback, initiating. Final transmission beginning. Ellen appeared on the screen, and she looked like someone who had walked through fire and come out transformed. She was holding a child, maybe 2 years old, who clung to her with small fingers. Behind her, the base was clearly in its final stages of collapse. But Ellen's face held something that made Arvin's breath catch. "Peace. If you're seeing this," Ellen began, her voice stronger than in previous recordings, "then you did it. You turned the device on at sunrise, just like I asked. Thank you for that. For trusting instructions from a dead woman in a dead language from a dead world." She smiled at the absurdity of it. "I've recorded this message 17 times, trying to figure out what to say to beings I can't imagine, in circumstances I can't predict, for purposes I can't define. So I'm just going to tell you the truth, and hope it matters." The security shuttles were visible now, screaming across the desert toward their position. "We failed," Ellen continued, "as a species, as stewards, as the self-proclaimed intelligent ones. We knew what we were doing to our world, and we did it anyway. We fought each other over resources instead of sharing them. We built weapons when we could have built gardens. We chose profit over survival, convenience over consciousness." Arvin heard the shuttle's engines now, minutes away. "But," Ellen's voice took on a different quality, defiant, "we also did something else, something that maybe mattered more in the end." The video shifted, showing overlaid footage. Arvin recognized some from the corrupted fragments. But there was more. Humans forming lines to pass food during a famine. Humans diving into floodwaters to save strangers. Humans teaching children in the ruins of schools. Humans planting trees they'd never see grow tall. "We cared," Ellen said simply. "Against all logic, against all evolutionary sense, against the cruel math of survival, we insisted on caring. About each other, about other species, about a future we wouldn't live to see." The shuttles landed. Doors opened. Security forces poured out, weapons ready. Director Thurek emerged, his Zorkon frame radiating authority and anger. "Arvin Sulk, step away from the device immediately. By order of the Coalition Historical Preservation Committee, I am authorized to confiscate and seal this artifact." Arvin didn't move. Behind him, the video continued to play. "We loved when love was impractical," Ellen's voice carried across the desert. "We hoped when hope was irrational. We tried to be kind even when the universe gave us every reason to become cruel. That was our strength, not our technology, not our accomplishments, our ridiculous, stubborn insistence on caring when caring cost everything." "Final warning," Thurek advanced, and now Arvin could see something in the director's eyes. Not just anger, fear. Fear of what this device represented, a truth that would destabilize everything the Coalition had built its historical narrative upon. Lyra stepped beside Arvin, then Jex, then Ven and the other technicians, a line of scholars standing between guns and truth. "You're going to have to go through us," Lyra said. and her voice didn't shake. "You're willing to end your careers, face imprisonment, for a device that tells you nothing useful?" Arvin found his voice, and it was steady. "She left instructions for us, beings who didn't exist, from a world that no longer exists. She believed we'd find this. She believed we'd care. The least we can do is prove her right." On screen, Ellen continued, "I don't know if you're like us, if you feel what we felt, if you struggle like we struggled. But if there's anything of us in you, I hope it's this." She held up the child, who was now sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. "The ability to love something knowing you'll lose it, to care for someone knowing it costs you, to hope for a future knowing you won't see it. That's what made us human, not our weakness, our strength." Thurek's security forces raised their weapons. "Stand down!" came a new voice. Everyone turned. A Vela elder had emerged from one of the shuttles, someone Arvin recognized from coalition leadership. Elder Mora, head of the historical archives. She walked slowly to the device, looked at the screen where Ellen held her child. "I was there," Mora said quietly. 6,000 years ago. I was young, barely a researcher, and I met them, the humans, before the end." Lyra gasped. "The genetic memory. It was you." "We were forbidden from recording contact. The Coalition deemed humans too dangerous, too chaotic. We were ordered to observe from distance only." Mora's eyes glistened. "But I didn't just observe. I spoke to one, a woman working in a garden that couldn't possibly survive their world's collapse. I asked her why she bothered. She said, 'Because kindness is never wasted, even when everything else is.'" Mora turned to Thurek. "Lower the weapons, let her speak. Elder, the historical narrative is a lie we told ourselves to feel superior." Mora's voice carried absolute authority. "Lower them. Now." The weapons lowered. Ellen's final words echoed across the desert. "If there's anything left of us when you find this, I hope it grows. I hope it spreads. I hope it teaches you what we learned too late. That caring isn't weakness. That hope isn't foolish. That choosing gentleness in a harsh universe isn't surrender. It's the bravest thing anyone can do." She kissed the child's forehead. "We're just humans, imperfect, flawed, gone, but we tried to leave you something better than weapons or warnings. We tried to leave you love." The screen showed one final message: "Battery 0, 8%, saving critical data." Ellen looked at the camera one last time, and Arvin felt her gaze across millennia. "Thank you for finding this. Thank you for listening. And if you learned anything from us, please let it be this: care for each other, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." She smiled through tears. "Goodbye, and good luck." The screen flickered. Battery critically low, and in that moment, Arvin understood. This wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The start of something humanity had planted 6,000 years ago, finally breaking through the soil. The device didn't shut down. Not yet. Instead, the screen pulsed with a new message. Additional files detected. Extracted during solar charge. Corruption repaired. Play? Arvin's hand shook as he pressed yes. The video that appeared was different from the others. Ellen was alone this time, seated on the floor of what looked like an empty storage bay. The child was gone. Everyone was gone. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, but her eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before. "Okay," she said, as if resuming a conversation. "You deserve the whole truth, not the sanitized version, not the heroic myth. The actual truth of what we were and what we did." Around Arvin, the gathered aliens drew closer. Even Director Thurek had stopped his protests, transfixed by the woman on the screen. "We destroyed our world," Ellen said flatly. "No sugarcoating it. We knew fossil fuels were killing us, and we burned them anyway. We knew our oceans were dying and we kept dumping waste. We watched our atmosphere collapse in real time and argued about whether it was really happening. We had the knowledge. We had the technology. We just didn't have the will. Her voice cracked. By the time we decided to act, it was too late. The cascade failures had begun. We tried everything. Atmospheric processors, ocean rehabilitation, massive reforestation. We threw every resource we had left at saving Earth. She gestured to something off camera, and the video switched to external footage. Arvin watched, stunned, as massive human constructions appeared. Machines larger than cities, processing atmosphere. Thousands of humans in environmental suits, working in toxic conditions to plant forests that might never grow. Orbital platforms attempting to shield the planet from solar radiation. "We failed," Ellen said back on screen. "All of it failed, but here's what they won't tell you if they write our history. We didn't fail because we were barbaric or stupid. We failed because we waited until catastrophe to start caring. The tragedy wasn't that we couldn't save ourselves. It was that we finally became the species we could have been. Right at the end." Lyra made a sound that might have been a sob. The video showed more footage. Hospitals where humans worked without sleep to care for the sick. Food distribution centers where people shared their last supplies with strangers. Schools operating in ruins where teachers refused to stop teaching even as the world ended around them. "In our final years," Ellen continued, "we became something beautiful. We stopped fighting over borders. We shared resources. We helped each other regardless of nation, religion, or identity. We became what we could have been all along, if we'd just chosen it earlier." She smiled, sad but genuine. "There's a lesson in that. Not for us. We're gone. But for whoever comes next. For you." The video switched to show Earth from orbit. A planet visibly dying, atmosphere thin, oceans receded, vast sections of land barren. But in pockets across the surface, light still glowed. Human settlements fighting until the very end. "We could have left," Ellen's voiceover explained. "The colony ships failed, but we had enough resources to save maybe 100,000 people. Send them to orbital stations. Hope they survived long enough to find another world. But you know what humanity chose instead?" The camera zoomed to show one of the green pockets. Massive greenhouse structures surrounded by humans working to expand them. "We chose to stay, to spend our last resources trying to heal the planet, not escape it. We planted gardens knowing we'd die before seeing them bloom. We built structures we'd never use. We preserved seeds and knowledge and culture, not for us, but for whatever life might evolve after we were gone." Arvin felt tears on his face. He hadn't known his species could cry. Apparently, they could. "The Coalition will call this foolish," Ellen said, looking directly at the camera with eerie prescience. "Wasteful, irrational, and they're right. It was all of those things, but it was also the most human thing we ever did. Choosing to care for a future we wouldn't see. Choosing gentleness over survival. Choosing to leave gardens instead of graves." She stood, and the camera followed her to a window overlooking Earth. "This is my final message to you. Not a warning, not an apology. A gift." She turned back to the camera. "You're going to face choices, difficult ones. Your species, whatever you are, will reach a point where survival and morality conflict, where expedience and kindness diverge, where logic says one thing and compassion says another." Her voice intensified. "When that happens, remember us. Not as failures, as proof that caring matters even when it costs everything. That gentleness is strength, not weakness. That hope doesn't need to be rational to be real." The device beeped urgently. Battery at 0.5%. "We're just humans," Ellen said, and Arvin heard an echo of her earlier words. "Imperfect, flawed. We made every mistake you can make and a few you probably can't imagine. But we learned something at the end. Something worth crossing 6,000 years to tell you." She placed her hand on the window, touching Earth one last time. "Love isn't weakness. Hope isn't foolish. Caring isn't surrender. They're the only things that matter, the only things that last, the only things worth the cost.
The video flickered as power drained. "My species is dying," Ellen said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "But if you remember us, if you learn from us, if you carry forward even a seed of what we discovered too late, then maybe we didn't fail completely. Maybe we just planted something that took a long time to grow." She smiled one last time. "Thank you for listening."
Thank you for caring enough to watch this. And please remember, we weren't barbaric or self-destructive by nature. We were just afraid. And when we stopped being afraid, when we chose love over fear, we became beautiful. The screen showed one final image, the GPS coordinates flashing. But Arvin understood now. It wasn't showing Earth's location. It was showing home as a variable coordinate. Wherever this device landed, that would be home. Whoever found it, they would be the inheritors, the next gardeners. Home, Ellen's voice whispered, is wherever something grows from what we planted. The screen went black except for one line of text. Battery 0, 3%. Final data preservation protocol initiated. Thank you. Then, goodbye. The device beeped 3 times, slower now. Then silence. Around Arvin, no one moved. Lyra was crying openly. Her blue skin darkened with moisture. Jex had his eyes closed, processing something his carefully logical mind had no framework for. Even the security forces looked shaken. Elder Mora stepped forward and placed her hand on the dead device. "She was right," Mora said quietly. "The gardener I met. Kindness is never wasted." Director Thurek's voice was hollow. "This changes everything." "Yes," Arvin agreed, still staring at the blank screen. "It does." They had watched humanity's final lesson, and it had nothing to do with technology or war or the 1,000 things the Coalition had assumed defined the lost species. It was simpler than that, and infinitely more profound. Humans had taught them that caring was worth dying for, and that love, once planted, could cross millennia. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if New Helion itself was holding its breath. Arvin touched the device's cold surface. The screen was completely dark now. No flicker of life, no pulse of energy. 6,000 years of stubborn survival ended. The last ember of humanity's fire extinguished. And yet somehow it didn't feel like an ending. "She's gone," Lyra whispered, and the grief in her voice was raw. She'd known Ellen only through fragmented videos, glimpses of a life lived millennia ago. But the connection had been real. The loss was real. Jex was the first to move. He knelt beside the device, his careful scientist's hands hovering over it as if touch might somehow revive it. "I've spent 40 years studying dead civilizations," he said, his voice thick with something that might have been tears if his species produced them. "I thought I understood loss. I thought I understood extinction. I didn't understand anything." One of the security officers, a young Karuth Arven didn't know, lowered his weapon completely and sat down in the sand. His shoulders shook. When Arven looked closer, he saw the officer was crying. Actually crying. The first time in recorded history a Karuth had produced tears over something that wasn't a biological imperative. "I'm sorry," the officer managed. "I don't know why I've never, she taught us," Elder Mora said gently. "In less than an hour, across 6,000 years of death, she taught us how to mourn properly, how to feel loss for people we never met, how to grieve for beauty that existed before we were born." Director Thurek stood apart from the group, his 3 eyes fixed on the dead device. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, "I've spent my entire career protecting a lie." "Director," one of his officers began. "No." Thurek raised a hand, silencing him. "The Coalition's historical narrative, the comfortable story we tell ourselves about humanity being barbaric, self-destructive, their extinction being inevitable. We needed that lie because the truth was too uncomfortable. He moved closer to the device. The truth that they were better than us. Not more advanced, not more powerful. Better. They cared when caring cost everything. They hoped without reason. They loved without logic. And we, in our careful, logical survivor's pragmatism, can't even comprehend that kind of courage. Lyra looked up at him, tears still streaming. What do we do now? Thurek was quiet for a long time. Then, we tell the truth, all of it, even the parts that make us look small by comparison. Arvin picked up the device, cradling it like the sacred object it had become. The screen was cracked, dark, lifeless. But Ellen's words echoed in his mind. Home is wherever something grows from what we planted. She said goodbye, Arvin said, but she didn't mean farewell. She meant transformation, an ending that becomes a beginning. He looked at the gathered aliens, scientists, soldiers, bureaucrats, dozens of species who had never learned to cry, learning together in a desert under a rising sun. They died trying to leave love as fuel, he said, remembering Ellen's final message. So let's burn brightly. Then, the young technician spoke up. What does that mean? Practically. It means, Elder Mora said, we stop pretending efficiency is the highest virtue. We stop dismissing emotion as weakness. We stop building civilizations that survive but don't live. She turned to Thurek. I'm calling for a complete historical revision. Not just about humans, about everything. We need to examine what we've become in our rush to be logical, practical, survival-focused. We forgot how to care. They remembered, even at the end. Especially at the end. The security officer who had wept was standing now, though his legs still shook. My training taught me that emotional attachment is a liability, that caring makes you weak. But watching her... He gestured helplessly to the device. She was the strongest person I've ever seen, and she was made entirely of caring. Yes, Arvin said simply. That's exactly the point. Lyra had her scanner out, running final diagnostics on the device. There's no power left, not even trace amounts. It gave us everything it had. Like she did, Jex added. Like they all did. Arvin thought about the videos they'd seen. The man singing while cooking. The woman hugging her dog. The parents teaching their child to walk. Simple moments that now felt like treasures beyond price. They weren't extraordinary, he said, understanding flooding through him. That's what makes this so profound. They were ordinary people who chose to be kind, who chose to hope, who chose to care. And that ordinariness means any of us could do the same. Could we, though? Ben asked. Really? Arvin looked around at the assembled beings. At Lyra, who had learned to cry. At Jex, who had learned to value emotion over pure data. At the security officer who had learned that strength could look like compassion. At Thurek, who had learned that comfortable lies cost more than uncomfortable truths. We're already starting, Arvin said. Director Thurek made a decision visible in the straightening of his frame. Arvin Solk, you and your team are hereby cleared of all charges. Furthermore, I'm recommending you for the position of Director of Human Studies, a new department I'm establishing as of this moment. Human Studies? Lyra repeated. Empathology, Thurek corrected himself, using the word Lyra had coined days ago. The study of how to feel, care, and hope the way humans did. Because if we're going to survive as anything worth surviving as, we need to learn their final lesson. He looked at the dead device. Battery's gone, but the charge remains. Arvin held the device up to the light. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the desert in gold. The cracked screen caught the light, reflecting it in 100 tiny rainbows. What do we do with it? Someone asked. Arvin thought of Ellen's words. Home is wherever something grows. And suddenly, he knew. We plant it, he said. "Plant it," Thurek repeated. "She wanted something to grow. She wanted her world's end to become something's beginning." Arvin looked around the barren desert. "So we plant it. Here. And we see what grows." It was irrational, illogical. A device couldn't become a seed. Technology didn't grow into life. It was the kind of thinking that his species had spent eons training themselves away from. It was perfectly human. "I'll help," Lyra said immediately. "As will I," added Elder Mora. One by one, they all agreed. Even the security forces, even Director Thurek. They would plant a dead device in a dead desert and see if hope could grow. Because that's what humans would have done. And they had learned, in the span of one sunrise, that human wisdom was worth more than a galaxy's worth of careful logic. The battery was dead, but the message was alive. And that made all the difference. 3 months later, the Coalition Historical Council issued their decision. The device would be sealed in the Central Archives, displayed as the centerpiece of a new human memorial wing. Protected, preserved, made safely distant by glass and museum lighting and explanatory plaques that would reduce Ellen's message to academic footnotes. Arvin read the decision in his quarters on the orbital station and knew, with absolute certainty, that he was about to commit career suicide for the second time. "You're really going to do this?" Lyra said. It wasn't a question. She was already packing her equipment. "She didn't ask for a museum," Arvin replied. "She asked for something to grow." "The council won't see it that way." The council never met her. Jex appeared in the doorway, carrying a portable scanner and what looked suspiciously like excavation tools. "I've been analyzing the device's material composition. There are trace organic compounds preserved in the casing, microscopic seeds, DNA fragments, biological material that somehow survived 6,000 years of entropy." He set the equipment down with a satisfied click. "If we're planting it, we might as well plant it properly." Arvin felt something warm expand in his chest. His species had no word for it. Humans would have called it gratitude. The device sat on his desk, still dead, still dark. The Coalition had allowed him to keep it for final documentation, before its transfer to the archives. They assumed he'd comply. They assumed wrong. "When do we go?" Ven asked, joining the conspiracy with the casual ease of someone who had learned that rules mattered less than reasons. "Tonight," Arven said, "before they realize what we're doing." Elder Mora had helped. The old Vela had used her authority to ensure the orbital defenses would experience a convenient sensor malfunction at exactly the right time. "I'm too old to watch another beautiful thing die in a museum," she told Arven. "Go, plant your impossible hope." The shuttle descent to New Helian's surface was quiet, each of them lost in thought, processing what they were about to do. Director Thurek had resigned his position as promised, and was now writing what he called the most difficult apology letter in galactic history to every educational institution that had taught the old narrative about humanity. They landed in the same spot where Ellen's final message had played. The desert looked unchanged, but Arvin felt different standing there. He was different. They all were. There, Lyra pointed to a lone crystal tree growing from the sand, New Helion's only native flora, a geological formation that somehow achieved something close to life. That's where it should go. They approached the tree together. Up close, Arvin could see how its crystalline structure caught sunlight and bent it into the sand, creating pockets of warmth where nothing else could grow. It was surviving through giving light to barren ground. "Perfect," Jex said softly. "She'd like this." Arvin knelt and began to dig. The sand was hot, almost burning, but he didn't stop. The others joined him, their different hands working together to create a space large enough for the device. "Wait," Ven said suddenly. "Should we say something? Humans had rituals for planting and death, and this feels like it should have words." They all looked at each other. None of their species had burial rites, no ceremonies for planting, no traditions for transforming endings into beginnings. "I think," Arvin said slowly, "that Ellen already gave us the words." He held the device above the hole they'd made, feeling its weight, remembering everything it had contained. Then, speaking to the desert and the dead woman who had crossed 6,000 years to teach them, he said, "You wanted something to grow. You wanted your ending to be someone else's beginning. You wanted to prove that caring matters, even when everything is lost." He lowered the device carefully into the earth. "So here's our promise. We'll remember. We'll care. We'll hope without reason, love without logic, and try to be kind even when the universe gives us every reason not to." Lyra added her voice. "We'll tell your story, not as a cautionary tale, as an inspiration. We'll teach our young that strength looks like compassion," Jex said, "that survival without living is just slow death." "We'll build civilizations worth surviving in," Ven finished, "because you showed us the difference." Together they covered the device with sand. The last they saw of it was the cracked screen, catching final rays of light before darkness took it. Arvin pressed his palm to the disturbed earth. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." For a moment, nothing happened. Just 5 aliens kneeling in a desert, having buried a piece of dead technology for reasons that made no logical sense. Then Arvin felt it, a warmth beneath his hand, subtle, barely there, but real. "Do you feel that?" Lyra breathed. They all felt it, a pulse from beneath the sand. Not electrical, something else, something that had no name in any of their languages but that humans would have recognized immediately. "Life, the organic compounds," Jex said, his voice tight with wonder. "Combined with the device's residual energy structure, they're interacting with the native crystalline matrix. It's creating some kind of hybrid genetic template." "In words that mean something?" Arvin asked. "It's growing. The dead device is becoming a seed, actual, literal growth." They sat there until the second sunset, hands pressed to the warm sand, feeling something impossible happen beneath their touch. As they boarded the shuttle for the return journey, Arvin looked back at the disturbed patch of sand beneath the crystal tree. It looked like nothing, like failure, like futile hope planted in barren ground. It looked, in other words, exactly like what humans would have done. "The Coalition will be furious," Lyra said as the shuttle lifted off. "Probably," Arvin agreed. "We'll be stripped of our positions." "Possibly. It might not even work. It might be for nothing." Arvin thought of Ellen's words, about planting gardens in ruins, about hoping without reason, about caring when caring cost everything. "Then we'll fail the way humans did," he said, echoing words he'd spoken before, trying anyway. Jex pulled up his final scans of the burial site. The reading showed something that made no scientific sense. The device's energy signature hadn't disappeared. It had diffused, spread through the sand like roots, merged with the crystal tree's structure like photosynthesis, become something that was neither technology nor nature, but somehow both. "What do we call this?" Ven asked. Lyra smiled, and it was an expression she'd learned from watching Ellen's videos, sad and hopeful in equal measure. "Legacy." "Legacy," Arvin repeated, tasting the human word. "Yes, that's what this is." They flew back to the orbital station in comfortable silence. Behind them, beneath the sand of New Helion, something impossible began to happen. Ellen's device, her final gift, her last planted seed of hope, was doing what no technology should be able to do. It was growing. And with it, the first truly human lesson was taking root across the galaxy, that batteries die, but the charge they carried can illuminate millennia. That endings are only endings if nothing grows from them. That love, properly planted, never stops flowering. The mission reports would call what they'd done foolish, emotional, unscientific. They would be right on all counts, but they would also be wrong, because sometimes foolishness is wisdom that hasn't grown tall enough to see yet, and Ellen had planted her wisdom very, very deep. Arvin returned to the site 3 weeks later, half expecting to find nothing but disturbed sand and his own foolishness made visible. Instead, he found a miracle. The crystal tree stood where it had before, but something was different. Arvin's shuttle had barely touched down when he saw it, a splash of color that had no right to exist on New Helion's monotone landscape. Green, not the translucent green of the crystal structures. This was dark, vibrant, alive. A plant, no larger than his hand, pushing through the sand precisely where they'd buried the device. Arvin fell to his knees beside it. His scanner trembled in his hands as he ran analysis after analysis, each one confirming what his eyes refused to believe. The genetic structure was impossible. It combined Earth plant DNA with New Helion's crystalline silicon-based matrices. It had chlorophyll that shouldn't function in this atmosphere, and root structures that drew moisture from sand that contained almost none. By every law of biology, Arvin knew it could not exist. It existed anyway. Stubborn, he whispered, touching one perfect leaf. Just like them. The plant was warm under his fingers, warmer than the surrounding environment. It was generating its own heat somehow, creating a microclimate around itself. As he watched, a second leaf uncurled, reaching toward the sun with what could only be called determination. Arvin activated his communication device with shaking hands. "Lyra, Jex, Ven, you need to see this. Now." The response was immediate. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." Arvin laughed, a sound that came out half-sob. "Everything's impossible. Get down here." They arrived within hours. Lyra saw the plant and dropped her equipment, covering her mouth with both hands. Jex ran every scan he had, then ran them again, then sat down hard in the sand. Ven simply stared, his young face showing something that looked like religious awe. "It's really growing," Lyra breathed. "They really did it. 6,000 years after they died, they're still creating life." "Not just creating," Jex corrected, his scientific training reasserting itself despite his shock. "Transforming." The device's organic compounds merged with local crystalline structures. The residual energy created a template, and the battery, the actual battery chemistry, it's fertilizer. Literal fertilizer. The power source became nutrients. "They turned death into food," Arvin said. "Of course they did." Over the next days, they documented everything. The plant grew visibly, adding leaves at an impossible rate. More impossibly, it began to change the sand around it. Chemical analysis showed the soil was becoming richer, more complex, capable of supporting more life. One plant, born from a dead device, was terraforming New Helion 1 grain of sand at a time. Word spread. Scientists from across the coalition began arriving, drawn by reports that ranged from exciting to heretical, depending on who was telling them. The plant became a pilgrimage site, a controversy, a revolution. Elder Mora arrived in an official diplomatic vessel, walked directly to the plant, and sat beside it for 3 hours without speaking. When she finally rose, she said only, "The woman in the garden." She was right. Kindness grows. Director Thurek came. No longer a director, but just Thurek now. Stripped of his titles, but somehow seeming more substantial without them. He studied the plant in silence, then turned to Arvin. "I spent 50 years building a narrative that humans were failures, barbarians, extinct for good reason." He gestured to the green leaves catching sunlight. "How long did it take them to prove me wrong?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Thurek repeated. "After 6,000 years, their patience is humbling." Lyra had been running genetic analysis on the plant's structure. "There's more," she said, pulling up holographic displays. "The DNA contains sequenced information, not random, deliberate. Ellen encoded data into the genetic structure itself." "What kind of data?" Arvin asked. "Instructions. For agriculture. for terraforming, for sustainable ecosystem development. Lyra's voice was thick with emotion. She knew the device might end up on a dead world, so she made sure it carried everything needed to make that world live again. But that's not all, she continued, magnifying another section of the genetic code. There are also memory markers, experiences, emotions. She encoded the essence of human culture into plant DNA. This isn't just a seed, it's a teacher. Ven had been examining the crystal tree. The hybrid is spreading into the native structure. The tree is changing, adapting, learning to be more alive. As they watched, the crystal tree's translucent branches began to show the faintest hint of green, chlorophyll mixing with silicon, life teaching stone to grow. "It's contagious," Jex said, wonder in his voice. "Humanity is contagious." More ships arrived, then shuttles, then entire delegations. Within a month, the site had become the most visited location in the sector. Beings from 50 species came to see the plant that shouldn't exist, growing in a desert that wouldn't support it, teaching a universe that had forgotten how to hope. Some came as scientists, some as pilgrims, some simply as students, ready to learn from a dead woman's final lesson. Lyra founded her Institute of Human Empatology in a temporary structure near the site. The first class had 200 students from 30 species. By the second semester, they'd had to expand 3 times to accommodate demand. Arvin watched them sometimes, young beings learning to feel, to care, to hope without reason. Learning to be human in all the ways that mattered, without being human at all. One day, a young Karuth approached him. "Professor Arvin, I wanted to thank you. Before your discovery, I thought emotions were weakness. Now I understand their strength. I want to study human philosophy. Can you recommend where to start?" Arvin thought of Ellen's words, of the man singing while cooking, of the woman hugging her dog, of parents celebrating a child's first stumbling steps. "Start with everyday moments," he said. "The small kindnesses, the irrational hopes, the stubborn love that persists without reason. That's where humanity's real strength lived." The student nodded seriously. "The ordinary as profound." "Exactly." 3 months after the first leaf appeared, Lyra brought Arven a sample from the hybrid zone where crystal and plant merged. "Look at this," she said, barely containing excitement. Under magnification, the sample revealed something extraordinary. New seeds were forming, hundreds of them, each carrying the hybrid genetic code, each ready to be planted elsewhere. "One device," Lyra said. "One woman's hope, and now we have enough seeds to plant gardens on 100 worlds." Arvin held one of the tiny seeds, this impossible offspring of technology and determination and love that crossed millennia. She said home was wherever something grows from what we planted. "Then the galaxy is about to become very homey," Lyra replied, smiling. They stood together, watching the plant that had become a revolution. Around them, beings from across known space gathered, learned, changed. The coalition's historical narrative was crumbling, replaced by something more complex, more honest, more human. "Do you think she knew?" Ven asked, joining them. "That it would grow like this? Spread like this?" Arvin thought of Ellen's smile, her tears, her absolute certainty that hope mattered, even when it seemed irrational. "I think she knew exactly what she was planting," he said. "Not just a device, a possibility. Proof that endings are optional if you plant the right seeds." The green plant rustled in the wind, growing taller every day, teaching a desert to dream in chlorophyll, and somewhere in its hybrid DNA, in the code that refused to stop teaching, Ellen Reeves smiled through 6,000 years of death and said, "See? I told you kindness grows." The battery had died, but the garden was just beginning, 1,000 years later. The child asked her father, "Were humans strong?" They stood at the entrance to what had become known across the galaxy as Earth Memorial Site, the garden that grew from a weak battery. What had been barren desert was now impossible forest. Green stretched in every direction, fed by water that the hybrid plants had somehow coaxed from New Hellion's deep geology. Trees towered overhead, their leaves part chlorophyll, part crystal, catching sunlight and transforming it into life with an efficiency that put both nature and technology to shame. The father, a Karuth whose species had once believed emotions were weakness, considered his daughter's question carefully. "No," he said finally. "They weren't strong." The child looked confused. Around them, millions of visitors from hundreds of species walked through the forest, touching bark that was both organic and mineral, listening to leaves that sang when wind passed through their crystalline structures. "Then why do we come here?" the child asked. Her father led her deeper into the garden, toward the heart where the original plants still grew. 1,000 years old now, massive beyond belief, its roots had spread across continents. Every plant in the garden was its descendant, carrying the hybrid DNA that Ellen Reeves had encoded in a dying device. At the center, preserved in a clearing that felt sacred, stood a monument. Not grand, not imposing, just a simple display showing the last frame from Ellen's video. Her face, worn with grief and lit with hope, smiling at a future she would never see. Below the image, a plaque read, "They had no reason to care for us, but they left instructions of love anyway." The father knelt beside his daughter. Humans weren't strong. They were stubborn. Stubborn enough to hope when hope was irrational. Stubborn enough to care when caring cost everything. Stubborn enough to plant gardens in their own ruins. He touched the plaque gently. That kind of stubborn is better than strong. Stronger than strong, actually, because strength can be broken, but stubborn just keeps going. The child approached the monument, reading the ancient Earth Standard text that had been preserved. "Battery low," the words that had started everything. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means," her father said, "that even when everything is nearly gone, even when power fades and hope seems foolish, there's still enough left to light the future, if you choose to shine instead of surrender." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the impossible forest. A group of Vela students passed. Their skin shifted to a reverential blue, carrying samples of hybrid seeds to plant on their homeworld. A Zorakan elder was teaching younglings about the woman in the garden, the story passed down through generations now, transformed into something close to scripture. "Look!" The child pointed upward. From above, the garden formed a shape. When satellites first noticed it 300 years ago, it had caused galaxy-wide wonder. The forest, growing wild and unplanned, had arranged itself into a perfect heart. No one could explain it. The plants had no consciousness, no ability to plan. They simply grew where nutrients were richest, where conditions were optimal. That they'd formed a heart was pure coincidence. Or, as Elder Mora IV liked to say in her lectures, sometimes the universe appreciates poetry. The father and daughter made their way to the teaching grove, where Lyra's Institute of Human Empathology had grown from a small structure into a sprawling campus. Classes were always full. Demand never decreased. Every species in the coalition sent their brightest to learn the human art of caring without reason, hoping without guarantee, loving without logic. They passed a classroom where students were watching recovered fragments of human life. A man cooking and singing, a woman hugging a dog, simple moments that had become revolutionary. "They did normal things," the child observed. "They did normal things like they were miracles," her father corrected. "That was their gift. They found joy in cooking, in walking, in sitting with friends. They celebrated the ordinary. And in doing so, they made it extraordinary." In the center of the campus stood another monument. This one held the original device, or what remained of it. The casing had degraded, the screen long shattered, but the Coalition had preserved it in a stasis field. Next to it, a holographic display cycled through Ellen's messages on eternal repeat. A crowd had gathered, as crowds always did. The father and daughter joined them, listening to Ellen speak across a millennium. "We're just humans, imperfect, flawed, but we tried to be kind." An ancient Caruth stood near the front, leaning on a walking device. The father recognized him from historical texts. Arvin Solk, the archaeologist who had found the device. He was over 1,000 years old now, having undergone every life extension treatment available because, as he told anyone who asked, "I promised Ellen I'd see what grew. I'm not breaking that promise." After Ellen's message ended, Arvin approached the device as he did every day. He placed his hand on the stasis field as close to the actual device as preservation protocols allowed. "Thank you," he whispered, as he had whispered every day for 1,000 years. For everything. Then, something impossible happened. The dead device, powered down for a millennium, preserved in stasis, absolutely and completely non-functional by every measure known to science, flickered, just once, barely visible, but real. The screen, shattered and dark for 1,000 years, displayed 3 words in ancient Earth standard. "Thank you for watering us." Then, below it, "Humanity." The words appeared for exactly 3 seconds before fading, leaving only confused scanning equipment and several hundred witnesses who had no explanation for what they'd seen. "Did that just—" someone started. "Impossible," a scientist declared. "There's no power, no mechanism, no—" "She programmed ghost messages," Arvin said, his voice filled with wonder and something like laughter. "Ellen programmed messages to appear randomly, forever, just to surprise us, just to remind us she's still here." "But how? The power's been gone for—" "I don't know," Arvin admitted. "And I don't care. Some mysteries are better than explanations." The child tugged her father's hand. "The device still talks?" "Sometimes," her father confirmed. "Once every few years it displays a new message. Random timing, random content, always in Ellen's voice, always teaching us something." They explored the rest of the memorial gardens, past the wall of names where every human who had died in Earth's final years was recorded, past the Museum of Ordinary Miracles, filled with recovered human artifacts, a child's drawing, a wedding ring, a cookbook, a baseball. Objects that would have been trash if humans hadn't taught the galaxy to see beauty in the mundane. Past the Garden of Last Choices, where each plant represented a human who had chosen to stay on Earth rather than attempt escape. Millions of plants, millions of choices to care for their world, until the very end. As the second sun began to set, painting the hybrid forest in colors that no natural evolution would have produced, the child asked, "Will we ever be like them?" Her father thought about that. About how much had changed in 1,000 years, how Caruth had learned to cry, how Vela had learned to laugh, how Zorkon had learned to hope, how dozens of species had discovered that efficiency without empathy was just another word for emptiness. "We're trying," he said. "That's what they taught us. That trying matters even when success isn't guaranteed. That the attempt itself has value." They made their way back to the monument at sunset, joining the daily gathering. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy, standing in silence as light faded and stars emerged. Arvin stood at the front, ancient and undying, speaking the words he'd spoken every evening for 1,000 years. "The battery died, but the charge remains. The device is gone, but the message lives. Humanity ended, but what they taught us will never die." The crowd responded in 100 languages. The words translated, but the meaning universal. "We remember. We care. We hope." As they spoke, the forest around them glowed softly. The hybrid plants, part Earth, part New Helion, part Impossible Miracle, were bioluminescent. Each leaf a tiny light, millions of them together creating a constellation that rivaled the stars above. The child looked up in wonder at the living galaxy of light surrounding them. "They did this?" she asked. "Just by refusing to give up?" "Yes," her father said. "They planted one device. We got a forest. They left one message. We got a revolution. They hoped without reason, and the universe gave them eternity." As the family prepared to leave, the child asked one more question. "Dad, if we find another device, another message, what would it say?" Her father smiled, having learned the expression from ancient human videos preserved in the Institute's archives. "I don't know. But, knowing humans, probably surprise, we're still teaching you." The device flickered again, so briefly that most missed it, but those paying attention saw one final message appear. "P.S. Keep growing." Then darkness. Normal, expected, explainable darkness. But everyone there knew. In a year, or 10, or 100, Ellen would speak again. A ghost in the machine that refused to stay dead, teaching a galaxy that had forgotten how to hope without permission. The battery had been low. The love still worked. Humanity had died 6,000 years ago, but they'd learned to plant themselves so deep that death was just another beginning. And as long as the garden grew, as long as the hybrid trees reached for stars, as long as beings from 100 worlds gathered to learn the art of caring when caring cost everything, humanity would never truly be extinct. They'd just evolved into something better, a garden that sang in crystal and chlorophyll, teaching the universe one eternal lesson. Batteries die. Messages fade. Species end. But stubborn love, properly planted, grows forever. The child planted a seed before leaving, adding her small hope to the million-year forest. Around her, others did the same. They always did, because Ellen had taught them that planting hope was never wasted, even when outcomes were uncertain, especially when outcomes were uncertain. As they walked away, the father glanced back at the monument one last time. Ellen's frozen smile, captured across 6 millennia, seemed to widen slightly in the fading light. "Thank you," he whispered. And somewhere in the quantum uncertainty of corrupted code and impossible preservation, Ellen Reeves smiled back and thought, "You're welcome. Now keep growing. I planted you for a reason. The battery was dead. The garden was alive. Humanity had won after all, not through conquest, not through survival, but through the simple, stubborn insistence that love was fuel enough to power eternity. Humanity, oh yeah, even in death, especially in death, they'd taught the universe how to live. In the end, humanity didn't win because they were strong, brilliant, or prepared. They won because they were stubborn enough to plant hope in a place where logic said it would die, and unreasonable enough to trust that someone someday would water it. Their extinction wasn't a closing chapter, but a reminder that the smallest act of care can outlive entire civilizations. So now the question turns to us. If a dying species could leave a seed that transformed a world, what are we leaving behind today? Fear, or something that grows? When the moment comes to choose between survival and compassion, which part of ourselves will we feed? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, if strangers 6,000 years in the future watched our final message, would it teach them to hope or to hide? If you reach this point of the journey across stars, type the word seed in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. Tell me your city, your corner of the galaxy. And if this story stirred something in you, subscribe, like, hype it up, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters, and check the next video appearing on the final card. After all, the garden only grows if we keep planting together.